mentioned.
All right, so I'll start with the preface here. The growing opposition to the global dominion of corporate capitalism is confronted by the sustained power of this dominion, its economic and military hold in the four continents, its neo-colonial power, and most important, its unshaken capacity to subject the majority of the underlying population to its overwhelming productivity and force. This global power keeps the socialist orbit on the defensive, all too costly not only in terms of military expenditures, but also in the perpetuation of a repressive bureaucracy. The development of socialism thus continues to be deflected from its original goals, and the competitive coexistence with the West generates values and aspirations for which the American standard of living serves as a model. The Great Refusal takes a variety of forms. Do you have any thoughts or comments on this?
Again, now this comes to the definitions of socialism.
Yeah.
If you're using the definitions, I like to use the definitions from Mises.org, and socialism and communism kind of related. It's just when there's more public control of the means of production, that kind of sense. When communism is a full on, but socialism, I think it is some private sector allowed in there, but it's supposed to serve it. And what we look, I've come to the realization that actually, some of the people on the political left were actually correct when they were calling the United States fascist. Because it actually is closer to fascist than it is to socialist. Definitely closer to fascist than it is to anything that I would define capitalist as, although this is a different definition of capitalism that was actually created like before it was Mises and Rothbard kind of took it and like changed it to more mean like the anarcho-capitalist type of situation. But anyway, because it's a situation where the state is so massive and through regulation and different things has created certain monopolies that even if those monopolies aren't necessarily working directly with the state with a whole with a whole rotating door where it's like somebody works there and then they go into the private sector and they come back to the public sector just like bouncing back and forth. You look at the connection with the media and things like that. Oh, this is a media of that party. This is a media of that party, and they just cover different. It's like the PR for the parties. That kind of situation where you look at, for example, the power industry. Who's involved in it? How can you actually get to the power industry? It's completely regulated and controlled by the government. Yes, the government itself doesn't own the power stations, but they're in a situation where they limit and they control who's going to be running the power stations, how you can actually interact with the people, where you can build those power stations. So in all intents and purposes, they are actually controlling the monopoly of the actual thing. So when you come to that point, that kind of is fascism. So it's like some neo-fascism type of thing. So I don't even understand. Like, this is one thing that was coming back again when we were talking about what would Marcuse say about the world today when we were reading Repressive Tolerance, when he was pointing out certain structures in the government, and he was saying, and I was asking people right now, I'm saying, that's what the political left is now.
Yeah.
That is what the Democrat Party is now. Like, if Marcuse was alive now, I can't see him considering himself a Democrat. Like, I just can't.
No.
Like, it seems like he would be railing against what the Democratic Party actually is today. So that's kind of just my thoughts on this. So I'd be concerned. I'd be wondering what does he mean by socialism here, and what does he think? What would he think about the structure going on right now?
Well, James Lindsay has said, because he read this essay recently, that's how I found out about it, that the goal here was to create a bureaucracy-free socialism. Now, how that would even come into being, I have no idea. Again, we'll read through the essay, you know, let's give the devil his due, but it's like, obviously we could talk about the marginal utility, we'll get to that in human action, we can talk about the price calculation problem, but this idea that somehow this will spontaneously emerge and everyone will share everything, and I just it's magic. It's like it takes magic for this to happen. I don't see how. Yeah. Now, in fairness, he draws heavily on Freud, and I feel this is important because remember, Marxism was a blank slate philosophy, the idea that everything is just molded, everything's socially constructed, whereas Freud believed in repressed urges, trauma, all that. So he was sort of drawing from that and trying to combine it with Marxism. And to be clear, even though we call him a Marxist or neo-Marxist, he wasn't a pure Marxist. I mean, he had disagreements with Marx too, but he was trying to sort of marry some of these ideas and see if this is the road to socialism, as it were. All right.
Yeah, so. And some of those things are definitely right. Human beings have been very broken to come to the point where we are cognizant of some of the harm and the issues and what the good and the bad. It's like, I think when you beat a dog, you can tell the difference between a dog that has been raised in a nice, happy, kind environment versus a dog that has been raised to be a fighter, to be in a kennel and has been abused. And people see that and they don't walk and expect those two dogs to think the same. but those two dogs aren't necessarily aware that the dog that's in that kind of fighting situation is not like, oh, I'm an abused dog, I should have been peacefully parented or peacefully petted. They don't have that concept, so they don't have an ability of repressing certain things, or oh, there goes the dog that could have been me if I'd been peacefully petted. It's like, no, they don't have it, they're just the
No.
dog. So
Yeah.
but with humans we have that ability to recognize that, hey, there's something really wrong, like I shouldn't be this way, this has happened, and then I see this other human have this thing happen to them. Why do I react to it this way and that human reacts to it that way? And then you go to that religious aspect, like, oh, there might be something else out there. And I don't think we had identified the effect of peaceful parenting, the effect of how broken we've been as a species over time. So some of those things that he was coming, I think, was coming at the tail end of that, where we now have a lot more realizations about the real differences and the real positives and the real changes that humans can actually have. And I think that's something that's completely accurate there. Yeah.
And my understanding is that Freud, for all his errors, he did recognize certain things that were right, like the dangers of child abuse and all that, and that certainly is important. But at the same time, Freud himself was not very scientific. Again, well, Karl Popper, the idea of falsifiability, a lot of Freud's theories and ideas had to be taken on faith. They were true no matter what, like Marxism itself. And that's the irony of Marcuse using the paradox of tolerance to serve as the basis for repressive tolerance. But Popper himself was critical of Marxism, even the whole approach to history. He was critical of Freud, his whole approach to things too. Now, in fairness, you can be influenced by people and not agree with everything they said. But if Karl Popper went on, I forget how long he lived, but if he were to see Marcuse's things, I think he would have a lot of criticisms to make for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But like you said, it's the religious thing, it's the magic thing, because there was just certain things we just couldn't understand. Like, I don't know, there's certain things, like how would you be able to explain a computer to somebody who hasn't even seen like an abacus before, who hasn't even understood the basic concept of math?
Yeah.
So it's kind of that kind of thing where it's like there's so little that is actually known about the human condition, about sentience, about just existence, thought. That this is something I kind of asked somebody: could you convince, if somebody was unable to have an imagination, could you teach them, or could you teach them to be imaginative? That's the kind of thing where it's like, is there something where it's like there's some things where are beyond knowing, so you just add in magic, because science and these things like that came from that. How many years did people spend trying to do like alchemy, where it's like turning iron into gold?
Yeah.
And in the future, we might be able to actually lead into gold. Yeah. In the future, we might actually be able to do that.
Yeah.
By actually moving different things and going down to like atoms and changing things around and making different couplings and things like that. But the ways they were going through them was by evoking magic. And I think some of these results of having, maybe there is some way to get to that socialist type of idea without the bureaucracy. Maybe there is, that we're just not yet able to truly understand, because there's something about humans, about existence, about nature that we don't necessarily get. Maybe it's a kind of situation where once we get asteroids and there actually is an abundance of controllable and reliable energy, and we have human flourishing to the point where we have enough space, people aren't worrying about limited how much actual land on Earth, or the surface of the Earth, the actual land itself, forget that 75% of it is in water. The actual land, I think we only inhabit about 15% of it, tops, like even less.
Yeah.
So once we can find a way to have everything inhabitable, or other planets or other things, there might just be different things where there's different calculations, people are peacefully parented, where we might have just like different considerations and things in there where we just think we'll default into certain ways, but the current human being doesn't really follow those. The current humans don't take those actions.
It's funny you should bring up alchemy as well, because Hegel's been coming up a lot lately, because it's been argued that Antonio Gramsci, who helped influence the Frankfurt School guys, he went back to Hegel. They were trying to figure out where Marx went wrong, and they looked back to Hegel. And remember, when Hegel was talking about his dialectic, he said, I'm doing alchemy. And you think about thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the idea is, okay, you have a situation, some people act against it, and it produces something new. And he said he was doing alchemy. And I like James Lindsay's analogy on this, because there were people who tried to use mercury to convert lead into gold. And as you know, mercury and lead are both very toxic. He goes, look, you think you're creating gold out of lead? He goes, no, you're drinking mercury and ending up mad as a hatter. And he explained that's how a lot of these philosophies work. And that's where the Mad Hatter character came from, was that when they worked on brims of hats, they'd work with mercury, but it's highly toxic, so you're exposed to that all the time. You go nuts just from absorbing it through your skin and everything.
Thank you for listening. This has been a clip from an actual longer recording that I'll try to leave a link to on the screen or somewhere around here where you're listening to this.
Presents. 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 Presents.
Peasants.
Okay. Okay.